David Liggett with Data Center Hawk, focused on cloud and co-location, data center industry trends, and dynamic market. Hey, I'm David Liggett with Data Center Hawk, and I'm really excited to be joined by Tim Hughes, Director of Strategy and Development at Stack Infrastructure. Tim, thanks so much for joining us. Great to see you.
Yeah, happy to be here, man. I mean, I think it's been a long time coming. First time we met up talking about the Hawk was like 5 or 6 years ago. So I'm glad to be on the podcast with you.
That's right. And anyone that refers to it as the Hawk has been, around for a while and has seen the changes that we've made. But let's talk about you as it relates to how on earth you got into the data center industry.
Yeah, sure, man. I mean, a lot of people, when they jump into this question, it's like, here's my LinkedIn profile. Like, here's me enumerating that. So I'll try to avoid that. But weirdly enough, it actually started with me being in a punk rock band back in 2006.
Now we're talking.
We're talking, right? Like, this is not on the LinkedIn. This is a scoop. So so I was in this band with a guy that I was working at a Target photo lab with, weirdly enough. And so we were good buddies, and he got a job working in a Yahoo data center in Ashburn, DuPont Fabros, I think ACC3, old school. And so a bunch of people from Yahoo in 2007, 2008 made the jump over to Facebook, and he was one of them. And I was, it's a guy named Josh, and I was working at the time in a back room in a Target, just like pulling pallets and like filling shelves. And so he was like, he gave me a call. He's like, hey, data centers are kind of like logistics, but like with computers. You want to come in and check it out? I was like, yeah, sure. And we're still in a band together. Like, we met up a couple times a week to practice. And I came in, and I had just worked a night shift, and I went to a Five Guys I think is on Waxpool. So anybody that's been to Ashburn, everybody listening to this knows that Five Guys. And so I'm doing my interview at Five Guys to be a contractor at Facebook to pull pallets and push racks. And this guy George, I knew nothing about data centers. I barely, I was not a technology guy. This guy George is like shucking peanuts. I don't know if Five Guys still does peanuts, but he had like 4 bags of them. He was just shucking them and just like asking me all of these very like technical questions. And I'm just like sitting there like praying, like, okay, am I gonna make it through this? Like, I've just worked 12 hours straight. I haven't slept. And he took a shot on me, and I think like that's a big part of anybody that's entered this industry has probably gotten at least one kind of leg up from somebody else in the industry. And so that's how I got into working as a contractor for Facebook. I guess I pulled off enough questions, or he was distracted enough by the peanuts to like say, hey, yeah, I'll give this guy a shot. And like, what's the worst that could happen, So so I got in that way, and then worked my way up and moved eventually to California, joined the technical program management team at Facebook, doing a bunch of different projects, working with a very small group of great PMs, super technical folks, making infrastructure get built at Facebook, and then eventually joined the site selection team over there, and find myself here today working for at Stack for the guy that I worked for last at Facebook, Matt Vander Zanden, who's the chief strategy officer at Stack Infrastructure now. Yeah, so fun little way of getting into the industry. I think everybody has their origin story, and that one's mine.
How did all the work that you did, and maybe the iterations of site selection, and how did that really prepare you for what you're doing now at Stack?
Totally. I mean, the thing for me is what we're building as digital infrastructure. I prefer to call it technical infrastructure. Same diff.
Sure.
There are so many kind of pieces to it, right? And if you understand just physical infrastructure, buildings, data centers, that's a great piece to know, but it fits into a much larger ecosystem that creates the internet. And so what I was able to do was touch everything from operations inside of a data center, configuring Cisco 4948 pizza box switches, to program managing the first dark fiber long haul project that Facebook did, and understanding, okay, what is dark fiber? What does this mean? How does it bring advantages to large internet companies if they kind of self-perform on fiber, to decommissioning the first large data center that Facebook had at 200 Paul in San Francisco. It was called SF2P. Like, that was our internal name for it. And I made a project t-shirt and it said "Good Night Sweet Data Center," like instead of "Good Night Sweet Prince." It was really dorky, but decommissioning and understanding the end of the life cycle, right? And like seeing how, both from a software perspective and from a hardware perspective and from a facility perspective, where the life cycle of a data center ends, and then building a lot of data centers as well, and then eventually taking that knowledge base and bringing it into the negotiation space, the acquisition space, in site selection and development, directly on the data center from a hyperscale perspective, from a hyperscale campus perspective, and then leveraging all that and running the lease portfolio as well at Facebook. And so I kind of got to see a lot of the different pieces. Yep. And so it's nice to be able to step back and say, okay, I can generally understand what our clients are looking for and why they're motivated to need that. And so if you can understand the motivations and needs of your clients at a Stack infrastructure serving the largest digital companies in the world, that's important. And we can make better decisions as a company, where we want to build capacity, how much capacity we want to build, how we should position it in a specific market. What are people looking for? So just having that knowledge base is useful.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you were able to get such a diversified background. So many, I think, people in different roles. You kind of have your focal point, and that's what you do for however long, and then you move to the next company. And so I think it's interesting that you were able to do so much at a company like Facebook and pick up so many things along the way. That probably give you now a very well-rounded understanding, to your point, of needs and how to take those needs, not just on the site selection side of things, but actually like what is being put into the data center from a technical perspective, and how the buildings actually serve those needs, not just today, but 5, 10, 20 years from now. When you think about the big users out there that we refer to as hyperscale users, what are those needs today that you all at Stack and others are trying to solve for?
Yeah, I mean, simplistically, we're trying to buttress their existing internal self-perform capacity with essentially an external team that they can leverage in myself, in Matt, in our construction team, and our sales team, in our marketing team, to really understand what it is that we can provide, and just say, hey, there's a gap here in capacity in market XYZ. And we want to be there to be able to help fill that gap. And exactly how this industry is working right now, which is speed to market and the amount of capacity that you have coming online in that time frame is those are the two most important pieces of any development puzzle. And so a lot of times you have hyper growth curves, whatever those are, for whatever reason. And they're driven by a number of different factors, and you can point to kind of specific instances of those factors, but there are very generic factors that have been driving data center growth for the last 10 to 15 years. And so we keep a very close eye on what those factors are, and we say, okay, well, we're seeing things moving in one of these markets, and we feel like what that's going to result in is probably a gap for one of the larger users, and we want to work in a partnership role with them to be able to fill that gap. Because if you have the technical expertise in-house like we do, we're serving as a facilitator for additional capacity. We're not competing with anybody that's self-performing. We are partnering with them, and we're providing them additional pathways to capacity.
You mentioned self-performing. How for those in the industry that or for those that are looking at the data center space and they think about these big companies and they say, well, don't those big companies just do it themselves? what are the reasons that some of those companies like would not do it themselves? Because obviously you come from one of the companies that have teams dedicated to, figuring out where to build and how to own and all these different things. But then, just here at Data Center Hawk, we track how much capacity these companies have also leased from companies just like Stack and others. So, what is it that makes them feel comfortable about doing it themselves, but also, needing capacity from data center operators?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we are seeing at Stack is that, and I saw this when I was running the lease portfolio and I was doing greenfield campus development previously. Sure. It's just that certain markets, you have gaps. And I spent a lot of time assisting the capacity planning team in my previous life. And they're a big important piece of the puzzle that if you haven't kind of been in direct contact with, it seems a little bit arcane, but there's a lot of thoughtfulness and science behind it on trying to predict as much as possible where those capacity needs are going to be. One of the dynamics that I think that I've recognized, and I haven't really seen a lot of others talking about it, but I think is important, is you have a spread of those hyperscale users on a spectrum, with one end being first-party application demand driving data center demand, to the other being third parties driving data center demand. And what that means is if you are providing cloud services, and that is where most of your data center demand is coming from, meaning that you also have customers that are external to your business. That's on that end where you have that third-party supply demand driving it. If your internal applications are primarily driving your demand, then you're on that other end of the spectrum. Now, the reason that that's an important thing to think about is on the one end of the spectrum, with the first-party demand driving your data center demand, you can predict that a lot better. You can actually look at usage, historic statistics, enormous data warehouses that are just like keeping Hadoop in business for like just how your application works and grows. On the other end, you have insight into it, certainly, but you could have a third-party application that has demands that you're not yet aware of, and they can instantaneously spin up capacity. And then if you look at that spectrum and you say, okay, well, that increases your uncertainty on capacity planning as you move farther along that spectrum, then you can say, okay, the folks on this end might need more help and the folks on this end might be able to self-perform better. Because if your capacity plans miss, we're there to fill the gap.
Yep. So it's almost a predictable versus unpredictable. And with that unpredictability, you have to have flexibility in how you're approaching capacity. And by having access, to working with companies like yours and others, you all provide that service to them, and the speed to market too as well. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I was in Ashburn a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that one of the groups of people I don't think get enough credit in our space are like the construction and the design and delivery. I mean, the amount of logistics that they are working through to get 12, 24, 36, 72 megawatts online, which, a lot of times when you're talking about it from a market perspective, we just throw those numbers around. But the capital needed and the expertise needed to do that it's amazing. And I'm always, in Ashburn, you mentioned Waxpool Road, but like Waxpool and Loudoun County Parkway is like the main and main, I feel like, of that exact, that exact thing. Talk about from your standpoint, we've seen some changes in the way the hyperscale product has evolved. And, as it relates to like, 5-10 years ago when we were talking about wholesale capacity, we were looking at, turnkey data centers. So where, literally the companies would just, bring their servers in and set up their environments and everything was already completed. Obviously that has shifted a bit. So just talk about that. Like, why has that changed over the last, 5 years?
Well, I mean, I'll use one specific example and then we can kind of riff from there.
Yeah.
One of the things that I saw in my time in operations in my previous life was a shift towards integration and automation, internal to the hyperscale players. And it's trickled out also into a bunch of enterprises. So when I first started, I mentioned I was configuring 4948 pizza box switches, the top of rack switches. I was also racking DL380 HP machines. And those are 2U database type machines. And we were racking and stacking some Dell single U stuff. The reason I'm mentioning that is because we were actually getting delivery of pallets of servers, and then we were physically integrating them in the data center space. And then we were manually configuring them one by one in the data center space. And the reason what that creates is just like a massive amount of inefficiencies. And so what you've seen, and what I saw directly with my own eyes as we scaled up, because you have to do it as you scale up, is integration offsite of servers and switches, and they get delivered in these racks that are fully populated, fully cabled, and it's essentially a manufacturing process. Whereas previously, it's an extension of the server manufacturing process in a lot of ways. Whereas previously, it was, hey, you just have like your server people in the data center doing it. So when you have that type of movement to very specific types of integration, you then have your clients in the data center that want their space in their data center fit out exactly as it needs to be to comply with that integration. Because if you're deploying to 40 locations at scale, your space needs to be compatible with those racks that you're integrating. Otherwise, you have one-offs and you lose the value of scale of that integration. And so people wanted to come in and say, look, just give me white space, give me the power to the PDU. I will take care of everything else because I have standardized designs for everything else. And so we work with our clients on that. That's an important piece of the puzzle. We also say, hey, you want us to do some fit out for you? We're happy to do that as well. And I also mentioned automation. Same exact thing is happening with automation, where you want to be able to design your data center space, white space, exactly how you want it. You want your MDF here, you want your IDF here, you want to put your router here, you want to put your big switch here, and then you want to cable it exactly to your diagram. Because what happens is you roll your rack in, you plug that rack into power, you plug your fiber into your top of rack switch. It says, hello world, like it uses some sort of DHCP, like little ping. And then it says, hey, what's going on? And then configuration server picks that up and says, I know exactly who you are on this network, because of that you put that rack into this exact position based on an exact serial number, based on an exact port on a switch. And I can configure all of the servers and the switch exactly like you need it. And that rack is going to be up in half an hour, and it would take 2 weeks before.
Yeah, I think that's, just the maturity of the user process. And, it's been interesting to see how that has actually changed the way that, data center operators are designing facilities and changing facilities to meet that need. Your comment about, deploying at scale, you mentioned like 40 locations, and just how if one of those envelopes doesn't fit what you expect it to, it creates logistical problems. And so that makes a lot of sense. I think that's also really interesting because, as the designs have changed, like the pricing has changed. And, like one of the things that we talk a lot about is, when I got into the space back in, mid 2000s, the market was where it was, and it was less competitors. Well, now it's, much more competitive, and the product has changed a bunch. And so, but it logically makes sense when you think about it in the ways that you stated. So that makes a lot of sense.
And I think it's worth noting, but sorry, before we jump off,
go ahead.
It's worth noting that like there are fewer larger players on the buy side. There are more competitors on the supply side, and those larger players also have fairly standard. They're not all the same. They don't have all the same requirements, but they have kind of the same family of requirements. And so even though you have more competition on one side, you actually see a standardization on the supply side of what we're building, which doesn't mean you can't differentiate yourself, but it means that you're differentiating less on your physical white space or your electrical design or your mechanical design, and you're differentiating more on the overall product that you're supplying to them, where it is, how quickly you can deliver it, and how efficiently you can deliver it.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that over the last probably 2 years, that supply chain, commentary has been so important in the operator community, and you've seen a lot of standardization and focus placed on, hey, how quickly can we get capacity to the market, and how cost efficiently can we do it?
Can I just tag on?
Oh yeah,
on that one?
Yeah.
Because okay, yeah. Like for me, it's I think about this all the time. I spent last year setting up what we call our strategic supply chain, which is essentially what you defined, which we took as the 7 critical component categories: chillers, PDUs, et cetera. And we set up programs with key vendors to be able to have inventory available to us that's consistent with our stack basis of design, which is consistent across the US, and deliverable in a way that we can deliver capacity in 6 months or less. And we do that by standing up a shell, deferring the capital of this critical equipment, just investing in the shell, and then being able to deploy in 6 months or less. Is that totally unique? Not necessarily. Do we do it really well and better than others? I think so personally. I have to say that because I kind of set it up. But I was thinking about it like, that's just one subcomponent of the overall internet supply chain, right? Yeah. And so like, it's really interesting if you take a huge step back and you just look at the overall internet supply chain, and you say, I have everything for a data center, but I don't have a set of chillers, or I don't have, fiber plant to the building. It's just really interesting to see how the impacts of one piece of that can totally disrupt your business. So I was thinking to myself, I wanted to ask you a question, actually, if I may be so bold.
Oh, of course. Let's go.
So my whiz of marketing, Jordan, has got me thinking in like these listicles. You publish this article and it says the top 5 blah 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 to do blah blah blah, and so now I'm thinking about I think in like that context a lot. And so we're going through probably an economic recovery in the U.S. Fingers crossed. It feels like that's the direction we're going in. So let's just assume that is the direction that we go in for the rest of 2021. What are your top 4 or 5 impacts on the data center industry of the general economic recovery?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I believe that the larger players, like certainly the hyperscale companies, like in 2020, before we saw a lot of their growth related to the pandemic, we were already seeing growth from them. One of I think the biggest mistakes people would make about 2020 would be to say, hey, the reason that the data center industry grew so much was because of the pandemic. I don't think that. I do think that the pandemic played a part in that, but I don't think it was only because of that. So I think as the economy recovers, I do think those companies you'll see continue to grow at the levels that they are growing. And what that is doing, specifically in the U.S. in certain markets, is bringing more competitors to the space. In certain markets, it's driving rates down because of just supply and demand. But if you flip to like areas like Europe and Asia, it's creating a very interesting set of market dynamics there that a lot of U.S.-based providers and European providers are, I think, doing as much work as they've ever done to try and get ahead of what they believe the demand will be. So that's one thing. We don't always see like a lot of demand from outside market, like companies outside the U.S. coming in here. That was one thing that was a bit unique about 2020. But we certainly see the U.S. companies going out, right? And so one, I do think maybe perhaps a change that could take place in the U.S. would be as some of the geopolitical things get calmed a bit. Perhaps some of those companies feel a bit more comfortable. taking larger demand here in the U.S. Typically, international demand has been like in the 4 to 9 meg range, and last year that changed. So that would be something I think would be, as there is a recovery, that could impact the space as well. I do think even in some of the other industries, the financial industry and the healthcare industry specifically, I think as the economic engine begins again and people feel better, you will see some growth in those markets. As an example, Northern New Jersey is a market that has been focused on by the financial companies for a long time, but there's been almost a lull in that market of demand for about 4 or 5 years. And in the last 12 months, we've really see that start to pick up. So all those things I think would be impacts of economic recoveries, to our space specifically.
So kind of the non-tech companies that still have large data center demands, like banks, financial institutions, healthcare, kind of the folks that still need to do their own data centers and are staying away from the cloud for now, their discretionary spending on IT is going to come back to kind of pre-2020 levels. So we might see some demand pickup from them.
Yeah, it feels like it, and I think too, as I think it's really really easy for us in the data center space to think that companies are a lot more maybe mature and further along in their IT strategy than they really are. We talk so much about cloud, and we have seen a lot of cloud growth, but you also have to take that back to the organization itself and how, while I'll use when you worked at Facebook, it's we have whole teams of people that do this work and are very smart and technical. Some of these organizations have, their team might be literally 3 people that are trying to figure out these massive projects that are key for their companies to succeed. And if they don't get it right, they've got, massive issues for the companies themselves. So watching that spending pick up, and, we've already heard, just in the work we've done at the beginning of the year, that the transactions in our space that are in between 100 kW and a megawatt, which we kind of call enterprise demand, that's actually been increasing. And in certain markets, you're starting to see a lot more activity around maybe some of those companies that paused in 2000 or 2020 because of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing similar trends on our side. So I kind of put you on the spot. Do you want me to give you
I love it.
My listicle?
Yeah, I'd love it. Come on.
All right. So here's a couple of thoughts. And the reason I brought it up is because we were talking supply chain. And so one of my things is, what's going to happen with the supply chain, right? Data centers are an important part of building the, digital economy, or however you want to think about it. But we're still one small piece of industrial growth, manufacturing, we're a subcategory, right? Steel is coming in, concrete is coming in. And so it's going to be really interesting to see raw material impacts. And we're already seeing that across the board, to be quite honest. Both time and cost is increasing. And then, if we have increased demand for even subcomponents of the critical components in data center, like a fan, maybe that fan is used by other things outside of data centers, and there's just a run on it. And then, we can't get any of those fans for whatever mechanical system we're using, or fan walls. And, how will that impact delivery? So I think right now we are trying to be as thoughtful as possible as how do we position ourselves in the data center specific supply chain, as well as the overall global supply chain, to make sure that we're able to continue to execute on the plans that we set a couple of months ago. And so I think that's going to be interesting to see. And it could be a story, it could fizzle, who knows, but it could be a story of 2021 in data centers. And I think it's interesting to watch. To your point on, sorry, did you have a...
No, I was just going to say, I think you certainly, it's funny that you mentioned just that on the data center and kind of global side of things. And I think it is important, there's a lot of wisdom in thinking kind of above your specific area of influence from a data center standpoint. But, it's something we're seeing certainly in the housing market, here in the U.S. And I know every city would be different, but there's just not a lot of supply on the market today, and it's, caused construction prices to go up, material prices to go up. So, we're already seeing some of that just in, on the residential side. So sorry, keep going.
No, you're right. And honestly, everything's interconnected when you're thinking about, raw material inputs
Yep.
into these types of projects. Um, the other thing that I've been looking at is demand, and you kind of referenced it. I've been thinking about, my simple formula for demand is application weight, like how complicated an application is, which impacts how many servers you need to serve it, multiplied by time spent on an application, multiplied by number of people using it. And you can kind of just like take that into the entire internet and like kind of get a sense of what's going on. And so, my question is, what are the applications going to be looking like this year? And I think, I think it's going to be a little bit of a mixed bag there in a weight perspective, because you're probably going to have the reduction of some kind of VC heavy stuff. Though, to be fair, once you get a VC connection set up, it's actually not that heavy on a server, which is interesting. There's a lot of peer-to-peer and like on device processing. And then like, what are people going to be doing when they get back to mobility? You know what I mean? What are the applications that they're going to be using? And I think that we're probably going to see an uptick in all sorts of things that maybe hadn't even been there pre-pandemic. And then, number of time, like you only have 24 hours in a day, but it feels like everybody's trying to turn that into 24 hours of internet connectivity, right?
Sure.
Like,
yeah,
it's wild. And then people, we're definitely going to see an increase in people on the internet. Like we're seeing both, even in the US with rural broadband investment, that's meaningful. And globally, the uptick in folks that are getting online is just going to continue. And so I think we're going to see all of those things driving a very healthy growth across the industry, that I think is just going to be buttressed by economic growth, because if you have more money in your pocket, you're more willing to buy a smarter device with a faster connection, which maybe, takes more server capacity in a data center. And other than that, if government starts to get invested in stuff, like if infrastructure plans pass in the US or elsewhere, you could see kind of maybe increased transmission capacity in the electrical grid. That could be interesting for data center location. That could be interesting for renewable energy location to support those data centers, which is really hand in glove with data center development now. You could also see fiber investments that makes things interesting for where you might site a data center. And then you could just see a lot of investment going into this, which, to our earlier point, heats things up even further and could actually create additional supply chain risks, or even inflationary trends, at least in the short term, that could result in maybe a higher cost of capital for investors or for developers. So there's a lot going on that I'm really looking forward to see what happens in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We are, I oftentimes, I think it points to the fact that the industry is so young, and we're dealing with, massive amounts of demand and capital going into the space in this time period. How does like what you mentioned impact the Stack portfolio? You all have if people are watching this and you're not aware, I mean, Stack has locations across the U.S. in major data center markets where these big companies are looking. So maybe talk about your current portfolio and like how what you mentioned before might impact how you grow over time.
Yeah. That's a good way of thinking about it, because that's actually my job at the end of the day, not to just like think about
there you go.
Bond rates. That's certainly not my job. For me, what it means to me is we're going to have continued significant growth in the primary markets. Northern Virginia is going to just continue to see massive growth, and you can kind of slice and dice that region 10 different ways. But unless there are, my take is, unless there are like pretty significant policy changes, you're going to continue to see massive growth, and we are positioning ourselves to take advantage of that. We got a lot of capacity already in the market, and our pipeline for additional capacity. I spend 5 hours of my day every day thinking about, and I'm very excited about it. So we're going to take advantage of that. It's going to keep growing, and it's going to be mainly driven by that continued explosion on the cloud side. And then, these markets that we're in that are kind of non-traditional market, old school thinking was like, hey, you got your West Coast location, you got your East Coast location, maybe you go to like somewhere in the Midwest. That was like, 2010 called. And so that's changed pretty significantly, both on the folks that are mainly serving first-party applications, but more so on the cloud side, where we're seeing just this massive kind of localization war, where folks are trying to get capacity closer and closer to the enterprises that are buying cloud capacity. And so that is what's driving our strategy in probably the majority of our markets, is that coupled with continued, the reemergence, to your earlier point, of the enterprise demand. Folks that want to be in Atlanta because they want to be in Atlanta is a great example. And so we have kind of this two-tiered strategy where we're saying, hey, we're going to make these big bets on these big growth markets. And then we know that there is appetite from our clients to have this localization. And oftentimes it's just driven by what their internal demands are. And then if you look internationally, which we're not in an international position, but if you do look internationally, folks are looking at data sovereignty laws, data regionalization laws, and kind of trying to read the tea leaves there as well. And so whether it's just purely a competitive play because clouds just want to get closer to their clients, or it's driven by something more on the policy side, we're going to see that continuing both in the U.S. and internationally. As folks kind of mature into data localization.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the international piece, because I think that's a big part of things moving forward. Certainly their demand is happening here in the U.S., but at least what we're seeing in, the main markets in Europe and the secondary markets over there as well. And then markets in Asia is just like a significant amount of growth. And I know that, it's interesting because I know obviously we're talking just about like access to capital and how important that is in this space today. The capital looking and wanting to invest in the data center industry, I think even before the pandemic was growing at a level that we hadn't seen before. And then, traditional commercial real estate, like other asset classes, office, retail, multifamily, the pandemic was not kind to those, those types of assets. And so investors are looking at the real estate market going, where can I invest and what's doing well? Really, it was data centers in the industrial market. And so we've seen a lot of capital. Yeah, we've seen a lot of capital come into space. Talk just about the impact that has on, the industry and, how you move forward, because that's obviously the fuel that you all use to go and grow in all these different markets.
Yeah, for sure. So you had mentioned international. We're not international yet. We don't have any plans for that right now. Who knows? But we don't have any plans for that right now. And so we get to focus kind of exclusively on the US, which actually simplifies a lot of the kind of macro problems. I've done international development in, I don't know, probably a dozen different countries in different flavors, from deploying racks to 150 acre campuses in Dublin. So, I've kind of just seen it from a past life. So if I'm mentioning that, it's probably just drawing on previous experience there. And from a capital perspective, I think it's two pieces of the puzzle. And we have an incredible finance team, which I get to work with every single day. So I'm going to cautiously crib some of their knowledge. And then also give credit to that team. We have a great CFO, Heather, who could school me all day in this stuff. So I'll just kind of give you my take on it, which is, you have kind of two pieces when it comes to financing these projects. One is kind of capital invested by these investors that you're referencing that are willing to take a little bit more of a speculative bet on something and saying, hey, you know what, data centers are growing. We want to put money into projects, and we want to create a platform or a portfolio or a pipeline of projects, or we just want to do one-off projects and, maybe buy a piece of land, maybe do some initial development, maybe go up to a powered shell, like we talked about earlier. And that's what the investors that back Stack, the great investors that back Stack, that's kind of what they're looking at, and that's where they're putting their money into. And then you have the folks that come in later in the projects that say, oh, you have a completed building, you have a signed lease that's like N number of years with this very creditworthy tenant. Yeah, we would love to participate in that, and we'd love to take advantage of that, especially because the rest of the places that you can put your money in from a debt perspective is tight. You know what I mean? Like that's not a secret. The rates are super tight. And so, you're seeing folks saying, oh, okay, like this has like a spread compared to my other very safe investments that I like, and I'm willing to put that money into it. And so we are able to take advantage of both in the position we are as a privately held company with excellent investors on the front end, and then the ability to access debt markets as we develop these projects. And that just gives us the ability to take a bunch of capital, invest it wisely, and then take it and reinvest it into a larger and larger portfolio and platform that, again, we're trying to use our philosophy of predicting in partnership with our key clients where they want to be so that we can fill that gap. And so the more access to capital we have, the more smart bets we can take in these various markets that we're in right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I think it's interesting to watch companies like Stack and others. Just use Stack as an example. I guess formed 4 years ago, and has grown to very quickly to a mature portfolio. That's in the places that these larger companies want to be. So I think we'll look back, I think, in 10, 20 years and look at how some companies like Stack and others have grown. And it'll be a really interesting deep dive on how access to capital, really helped fuel the growth. So that's something that'll be exciting to see.
And 10 years ago, you didn't have the type of investors in the space that you have now, even 5 years ago. And so you have these institutional investors that are great to work with, and that just really are fueling a lot of this growth. And the ability to, create competition and do things more efficiently. And I think, honestly, like a big part of it for us is really putting together the team in the right way. Because you can put together a small, medium-sized team at a company like this and create a platform that is both doing what I'm constantly focused on, which is like doing this predictive stuff and trying to get ahead and create a pipeline of projects that help our clients, as well as operating our data centers to these extremely high standards. Again, being in ops, I kind of got to give a shout out to those folks, and building the projects and operating the projects extremely safely to the highest standards in the industry. And so like, those are all important pieces of the puzzle. Because if you're just able to go and if you just hired me and said, hey, go land bank some stuff, I'm just like everybody else that's out there. But we've created a high caliber, safe operational platform that's at a national level. That's an important part of the overall business strategy here.
Yeah, right on. Okay, so just wrapping up from your standpoint, you're an interesting case study as regards to getting in the industry early, getting so much experience. Now you're on the ownership or the provider, data center provider side of things. When you think about how much you've seen in the past, 10, 15 years, and then, the next 10 or 15 years, what gets you most excited about, staying in this industry and being right in the middle of, some very massive decisions that are being made, not just on, the supplier side, but also the user side?
Yeah. I mean, for me, there's a bunch of reasons that I like working in this industry. I'll just say 3 of them. One is, we're doing stuff at massive scale that nobody's ever done before. That's, meaningful. And it is a transformation that we're seeing in the economy. I like being a part of that. I took my grandma to a digital realty facility in 2011. It was a small data center now.
Sure.
And I was like, hey, come on in. She's kind of, shuffling along. And I open a door for her, and the fans are whirring and all the servers. And she's like, what is this? That's cool to be a part of. And I like, that keeps me motivated. And then, two, the industry that we're working in, while imperfect, has a focus on sustainability and environmental stewardship, whatever you want to call it, that is different than a lot of other industries. And we're at the forefront of it. We can do better. We're focused on it. Our clients are certainly focused on it. And so that, for me, that's something I personally care about. I'm the guy that's like washing my recycling. It's probably not helping, but whatever, I'm doing it. You know, like, so like that thing, that's just something that matters to me. And so I want to be a part of an industry that does that. I couldn't be a part of an industry that, at the very least, I couldn't be a part of an industry that didn't think that way. And then three, I mean, we got to build a pipeline of new people into this space. And, you know, I am not I'm not currently earning a gold medal in doing that necessarily. Though I have brought a couple of people into the industry that I'm proud of having done that. I hope I gave them a shot, just like somebody gave me a shot as in the past. And so for me, like that's really important. We should get folks excited about this industry. We should work on training, and we should work on internships in the space that I'm working in, the space that you're working in, making sure that that's a pipeline of candidates that, you know, as a diversity that reflects the entire economy is, and the entire country, is a great way of thinking about it. And so I want to get better at doing that over the next 10 to 15 years, because for me, this industry completely transformed my life. Being able to go from working retail, which I was working my butt off and like making enough money to have bought my first house with my wife at 20. But it wasn't until I joined this industry that I really created a career and created success, both financially and kind of, you know, personally from a career perspective, that I could be really, really proud of. And so I want to give that opportunity to others. And I think we need to do that, because this is a growth industry that is unique to be able to provide that in the economy these days.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, and I love the thought of helping other people get into this space. It is such a, you know, when you talk to people and you ask them, hey, how'd you get into this industry? So many have a story like you do, which is just, you know, it was just kind of a random set of circumstances that I was able to join this team or join this person. And so I know for us here, that's a big thing too, is, you know, being able to open people's eyes to the opportunities that are in this space and industry, and that, you know, I think will be for a long time. So it's an exciting time to be in the space, and I know, like, from my perspective, certainly bullish on the future. Tim, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I think you got some great thoughts. So if you're listening to what we're doing today, or you're watching, you know, you can find more specifically on Stack Infrastructure at their website. I think it's stackinfra.com. I think that's it. Okay. And obviously, if you want to reach out to Tim, you know, please do so. But Tim, thank you again. We appreciate it and look forward to getting to do this again soon, man. It's been too long.
Absolutely. Thanks, man. This has been a ton of fun.